I have my friend here, Shahana Alibhai. We had a chance to do a little touch base a couple months ago, and I'm blown away with just her overall knowledge and wisdom in the world of mental health and also just in women's health as well. We're going to dive into all that today. But I also love that she's a mom and that she's kind of living this busy, hectic life. We were just talking about sort of at the moment, my sick children and her juggling the summer activities of her children. And so I love that she's just sort of this busy woman who's out there making a difference. And I'm excited to hear more about her story and what she does. So I'm excited to introduce you to my podcast listeners here on the Sync Your Life podcast, Shahana. So if you would just give us a little bit of your story, who you are day to day, and what led you to doing what you do.
Absolutely. And it's such a pleasure to be on your podcast, to have met you. You're nothing short of a powerhouse. So I'm sure your listeners know that already, but no, just grateful for the opportunity. Now, when it comes to my story, it's so easy, when you go to a dinner party and they'll ask, just tell me about you. It's easy to use things like, okay, I'm a physician. I work in the fields of adolescent mental health. That seems to be my world. I have 3 young boys, all under the age of 7. But it's taken me a long time to kind of strip myself of those titles and of those identities, because that's only part of who I am. I think if I look back, one of the reasons I even went to medical school was trying to fulfill this deep-rooted need for significance. I think all of us have this, but we are just too afraid to admit it. And for me, the greatest path, or the easiest path to significance, was through academics. I knew from an early age I could, excel. I could be the top of the class, but there was a caveat there. And the caveat was that the smarter I was, the more I helped you with your homework, the higher my GPA, then doesn't that mean you like me? Doesn't that mean we can be friends? Doesn't that mean fill in the blanks? And it's taken me many, many, many years to realize that excelling in academics, becoming a doctor is part of who I am, but doesn't speak at all to what I hold dear to me, which are my value systems. And no one ever taught me the difference between your identity, which can come and go. The minute they put the baby on your chest, now you're a mother and you're stripped of your other identity. Is that how we're doing now? Or is it the fact that your values are foundational to who you are? And the reason I bring this up is because you wouldn't have an emotion, you wouldn't care about something unless it went against something that you believe to be true, whether you really loved it or you really hated it. Both extremes are true. So I think we need to understand our value system in order to understand our reactions, and thereby getting a better sense of what is our emotional palette that we're constantly painting with.
Wow. Yeah, I have a feeling we're going to vibe high now, because hearing you say that just makes me think, like, I love this idea of this values thing keeps sort of circling back in different conversations that I'm having, not necessarily on the podcast, but just in my day-to-day life. I know that, when my husband and I were just recently talking about marriage, and we were talking about some dear friends of ours who were getting married, and we talked about these other friends of ours who are going through a divorce, and we were it was in the same conversation, and we were talking about how the values just no longer align, right, for the couple who's seeking this split. And it's just interesting to me how, like, that really is sort of the core of who we are and why we exist, and everything else is just like, what do we believe in? What do we hold valuable? What relationships are our priorities? And that really makes up who we are. I think back, and I know before kids, I was very similar to you. It sounds like seeking significance through work, through achievement, right? Like, how high can I go in my company? How high can I work? What corner office can I secure in my corporate job? Like, those were all things that I thought defined who I was, similar to you, right? The high GPA, the good test scores, like all that kind of stuff. And it's like all of that sort of went out the window when my children were born, because it was like, well, my children now take priority. And this is really an identity shift. We could go into our own little podcast on that alone. But you really have to kind of step into that new identity and say, well, this is now what I value, right? This is a change in my values because I'm changing and my life is changing. So anyways, I just wanted to sort of just acknowledge you for that, because I think that was an amazing introduction. I'd love for you to sort of tell our clients, more about just your story on what led you into sort of this field of medicine. Obviously, you were sort of seeking significance, but what is it about medicine and being a doctor that appeals to you?
So I think for the longest time, I started off in kinesiology. I actually did a year of chiropractic school. My husband's a chiropractor. And I often joke that I would have been a really good, psychiatric chiropractor, in the sense that I'm really good at asking you, well, how do you feel that your back is hurting? And how do you feel that your knee is hurting? But when it comes to actually adjusting or treating anybody, my hands-on skills are pretty pathetic. So it soon led me to a road that I loved the medicine and I loved talking to people. And somebody once told me, they said, that chiropractic and medicine are actually quite similar in terms of the theory. One treats with hands-on and one can actually treat through conversation, and of course, pharmaceuticals as well. So, and it's, coming from an immigrant background, my parents came here with the exodus of 1972. As many immigrant parents, they had absolutely nothing. And as many immigrant parents, they very much valued education, so much so that it was my parents who often told me, just become a doctor and then you can do whatever else you want to do. Well, easier said than done after 12 years of being enmeshed in this. And I called medicine the perfect hamster wheel. You start in at one end and you go round and round and round and round until they spit you out at the other end. And in between, that feeling of what I so hoped to do, which was to talk to people, which was to help people, somehow is confounded by this idea of never miss anything. Don't make a mistake. It's always the fear. So compassion fell out the window, and all I became shrouded with is fear, 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 which you see in a lot of medical practitioners. And when you combine fear with the need for speed, that often leads to burnout, doesn't it? And we know that 50% of physicians in the US alone meet criteria for burnout. And it's no wonder we're asked to do things we're supposed to do in a very short amount of time. That's so difficult. And it wasn't until I found the adolescent youth center that I currently work at and staff that I finally found a home, because I was, for the first time, remunerated for this idea that I could spend as short as 5 minutes or as long as an hour with a patient, and it didn't matter. And the patients in the waiting room knew that. Mm-hmm. And because if this is the first time a patient's ever going to open up to me about being transgendered or about having suicidal ideations or this big stuff, this is no time for walk-in clinic mentality. All of that was good and I loved it. But I use the analogy that I was right there with open arms to support you with your mental health. But yet I was basically boxed in and walled off from this idea that I would ever suffer from mental health issues because I felt like I was too good for it. My significance caught up with me. My ego caught up with me. I felt that my privilege, my educational background, and basically just my knowledge was immunizing me from ever suffering with mental health. I thought, I got this. I know this, until I had my first son, until 7 years ago, when I finally realized that mental health is not a you or me disease. It's meant for all of us. It's meant for all.
Yeah, and that's something that I wanted to dive into. If you're willing to share, I'd love to hear more about sort of what you've gone through as it pertains to postpartum. I have a lot of women who listen to the podcast, and postpartum anxiety is a question that I get often, especially in my digital course. Both of my children are adopted. So from a biological perspective, I didn't give birth. So, but I know that when we were going through our adoption training and education, there was still conversation about postpartum still exists, even through adoption. So I would love for you to speak to both of those things. I'd love for you to start with just your story and your experience, and then what you see in practice.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So when I gave my TEDx talk 3 years ago, I stood on that stage and I admitted to the fact that, it was my ego that held me back, but I only partially told the truth. On that stage, I used words like anxiety and panic attacks and depression, but I was lying to some extent. And the reason I couldn't tell the truth was because I didn't have courage 3 years ago, because the truth was that I not only had postpartum anxiety, but the correct diagnosis for me, and this is why I'm trying to be vulnerable and share, is because we don't talk about this enough, was postpartum OCD. Now, if we take a step back and look at postpartum, or even we should really call it perinatal, which means that these types of thoughts and feelings and emotions can happen during the pregnancy, throughout the pregnancy, and into the postpartum period. If we look at perinatal mood disorders, you can think of it as dividing off into two branches, perinatal depression and perinatal anxiety. Now, most of us have heard about postpartum depression. That's been around for a while. Perinatal anxiety is much more new. We're just starting to talk about it. But underneath the umbrella of perinatal anxiety is perinatal OCD, or in my case, postpartum OCD. And the reason when we hear OCD, it's very easy to conjure up images of celebrities, for example, that might not want to touch other people's hands, or might be worried about contamination and therefore washing their hands multiple times, or checking the stove 24 times before they leave. Postpartum OCD is not like that often. Often it has the intrusive thoughts without the compulsions, making it that much more difficult and that much more dangerous, because nobody can recognize it. You can look completely normal, have no compulsions, but people around you might start to notice that you start to withdraw. And that's exactly what happened to me. And the reason I speak so fondly of this now is because I have known women personally who have ended their life because of this, because this is so silent and because it is so detrimental and devastating. It brings you to your knees devastating.
Yeah, I'm curious if you could give us sort of an example of what those thoughts could be.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what, in full transparency, we do need to go there because this is what's going to help other people recognize it. So they have done studies to show that any new parents with their little ones, and they once did a very famous study where they asked parents if they've ever had a fleeting thought of could they by any chance cause harm to their child. So it could be a completely fleeting thought like, oh, I could drop my baby by mistake down the stairs, or I could do this by mistake. And the actual study stats was somewhere between 96 and 97% of new parents said, yeah, they had that fleeting thought, comes and goes, not bothered by it whatsoever. The subtype of people, and realizing this could be mothers or fathers, it can be the men as well, with OCD, the thought is tattooed in you. The thought will not leave you. We talked about that hamster wheel analogy. The thought of you doing, and harm is one category. There's other categories of it. It could be a religious connotation towards a child. It could be many different things, but I speak about harm because that's the one that I had. And it could be that, could I cause harm to my child? And the minute you get that thought, your brain goes into fight or flight, and you start taking very subtle behaviors to avoid any harm. So this could be hiding anything sharp in the kitchen, only wanting to be with your child when somebody else was there. Some people pray, you can do all these sorts of rituals because the fear grips you and it gets you. And there's no words for it. I recently had an actress that I don't know from Britain actually reach out to me, and she heard me on a podcast and said, thank you so much for talking about this, because this is exactly what I have. And you're not going to find this in any textbook. 7 years ago, when my first son was born, I found it in a little comment section on a small blog. Now I feel like we're starting to talk about it more, but still. So realizing it's under the umbrella of perinatal anxiety, it is a subtype. It is most commonly misdiagnosed as postpartum psychosis. And that is very rare. It still happens, but that is actually where you are having the real thought that you actually want to go out and do that. So that's with OCD, it is so terrifying to you having that thought. That is the branch point. That is the difference. But like I said, if as a family doctor, do I ever ask women when they bring in their new baby, how they're doing? We're not trained to. We just look at the baby. We do your head circumference and your height and your weight and do all the things with the baby. But do we ever look up and look at you and say, how are you? Mm-hmm. Now I do.
Yeah, there's so many things that I could say here. I'll start with this. I think I love that you're talking about it. And obviously it's needed. And like I said, when women are in the safe space of my support group, with my digital course, I see a lot of women opening up about it and saying, hey, usually it takes one to say, hey, I struggled with this. And then others will say, me too, me too, me too. Right.
Yes.
And in this world of women's health that I'm in, there are so many different stigmas about what's okay to talk about, what's not, right? Like periods aren't talked about. Sex in general really isn't. I mean, there's so many different things that just aren't talked about as it pertains to women. And this is definitely at sort of the top of that list. I want to know, and this might just be the nerd in me, and we can glaze over it if needed, but I want to ask from like a biomechanical perspective, or like what's happening in the brain, like what's causing this. And I'm assuming it can start as early as in utero, not necessarily when the child is born. Is that correct?
In terms of the person that actually has the OCD, or so you're absolutely right. So you hit the nail on the head that people who have postpartum OCD, the majority of them, not all, are coming into the pregnancy already having OCD. So you already are at a higher risk, not to say that you have to have it to have it, if that makes any sense, but you're absolutely right. Since the age of 5, I started experiencing these types of thoughts. Of course, there was no baby in my life at that time. So the harm type thoughts could come towards a family member. It's whatever you hold dear. If you hold religion to be very dear to you and you have an obscene religious thought, that is going to set you on fire in some ways. You know what I mean? That's going to get you. For me, it was the harm. It was the idea that I had to be perfect and do everything perfectly. So the minute that I had that thought, it was enough to completely numb me. But they're showing now that people with OCD, whether you have pure OCD, which is just the obsessional thoughts, or the actual OCD, they've taken it out of the DSM-5 criteria, ironically, and it used to be placed under anxiety. And from a biological and evolutionary perspective, they're saying, no, it's no longer technically under anxiety. I'm talking about in an actual textbook that psychiatrists use, because they've found that people with OCD have a separate brain loop. On an fMRI scan, a functional MRI scan, you can see this loop light up. It's a different loop, but similar to ADHD, which is a beast and a category of its own. So OCD has become a category of its own. And often when it is treated, it requires much higher doses of medication, if that's the route that you choose to go, to help blunt and quiet that pathway. And the other biggest misnomer is that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is thrown at anybody with mood disorders, depression, panic disorder, social anxiety disorder, does not work for OCD. It does not work. So you need a trained therapist in OCD in order to help you. And I learned that the hard way, because of course I'm not a psychologist, I'm a medical doctor. So that world was new to me, the world of counseling and psychology. But yeah, it's definitely been a journey for me, but I'm so thankful for groups like that you have, because the first time I ever shared my story, not even with my family, but with a close colleague, she turned to me and said exactly that. It wasn't OCD, but it was me too. Me too. Yeah. Like I've been there.
Yeah. So I'm curious what different treatments look like. Both feel free to talk both pharmaceutical and maybe more holistic natural approaches as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you could think of it in maybe 3 big buckets, one being the pharmaceutical, one being more of the counseling slash psychotherapy, and then one being the nutraceuticals as well. If we start with nutraceuticals, I think you need to think there's going to be no one size fits all. I always call it that Cinderella slipper analogy. It's whatever really fits you best. And people with OCD, and even if we just kind of take a step back and think of people who might have any sort of perinatal mood disorder for a second, there is a huge role for nutraceuticals. I think for me, I need to be very careful if people are already on medications, and because of course all natural products can have their own side effects, but I quite freely feel comfortable recommending these 3. Which is omega-3 fatty acids. We know if you have an EPA level of at least 1,000 milligrams in a clinical trial, Patients who were taking EPA 1,000 milligrams versus people who were taking Prozac 20 milligrams had the same outcome. And not only that, it's synergistic with an SSRI like Prozac or Zoloft. So it actually works in conjunction. So I deal with a lot of youth, and a lot of them might not be as compliant with their fish oil, but I often will tell them, if you're already on Prozac, Zoloft, Cipralex, take the fish oil too, because it's going to make it work better. Like, you might as well do that. Second thing is L-theanine, the calming extract in green tea. I know from the work of Dr. Andrew Huberman out at Stanford, he clearly says that, for him, that's quite safe for most people. And I haven't found any interactions with that. A dose of 400 milligrams at night and 200 milligrams throughout the day, just for that calming effect. And then magnesium. So magnesium biglycinate, the citrate is the laxative version. So if you want more of the one that helps with that feeling of just feeling a bit more calm, magnesium biglycinate at night. So unless you have a serious clotting disorder, then talk to your doctor about the fish oil. Otherwise, those three I think are quite safe and easy to add to your daily routine.
I love that you started with the nutraceuticals. And these three are all supplements that I endorse to the women who I'm dealing with in my course who are dealing with hormone imbalances. I mean, magnesium and L-theanine especially. So when you said L-theanine, I'm over here like nodding my head, right? Promoting those GABA receptors in the brain and helping people with their mood. I'd love to hear also, you've kind of touched on, you've kind of bridged the gap really between, I mean, your experience alone has sort of bridged the gap between what I would call sort of like the psychology perspective of health and sort of the physical body, right? You've talked about how when you're in appointments, when you're the doctor facilitating an appointment with a client, of course, and I always say this too, I've been in that position where I've been the patient on the other end, and you feel like you were going to have 20 minutes, but now the doctor's behind for XYZ reason. So now you really have about 8 minutes to communicate your issue before you're booted, right? And I say that with love because modern medicine most definitely has a place in this world. But I'm just curious, when it comes to women who might be listening to this, who are thinking, ooh, like this is hitting me in all the places, right? Like this is something I need to investigate. When they go to meet with their doctor or schedule an appointment or whatever, regardless of whether it's a functional doctor or maybe it's their OBGYN or whoever, what's your advice as far as how they should communicate what's going on with them and maybe ask for more time to communicate that?
Yeah, that's a great point. Of course, I don't know exactly how it works there, but for here, my best advice for you, because I also work at a conventional family practice clinic here in Canada and British Columbia, where, we're scheduled for 7-minute appointments. So when I see a woman come in, and they often will come in with a list and they bring out their phone or their piece of paper, and that's when I know there's lots going on. So number one, I will get them to read off their list. So because often when you go, I know how that feels as a patient, you get a bit frazzled, you feel pressed for time, write everything down. And if you can even take the time to make the connections where you can. I tell my patients, you know your body best. You do. I don't know your body. You know your body. So write everything down. And then you can kind of say, like, I had a patient the other day, she's got headaches and some weight gain, and she wasn't sleeping well. But really, a lot of the things, her husband of 30 years just walked out and left her. Like, if I hadn't specifically asked, what's going on in your emotional life, what's going on, then she dissolved into tears and it all came out. So there's a part of that is write everything down, put the connections where you think you can, be prepared to be vulnerable. And that's okay, because I'd much rather that than try to spend the next 10 minutes digging it out of you too. I hate to say this, but set the bar, don't set your expectations high. And I'm saying that with love, because the idea is be prepared to come for multiple appointments. And I will always tell this to my female patients, especially. I know that luckily here it's free, and that also helps a lot too, but can we chat next week? Can we pick up that another issue? The last thing I want to do, and doctors will always do this because we want to feel useful. So guess what? Here's an x-ray, here's blood work, here's some prescriptions to try. You get all this stuff and you go, well, maybe I'm doing you a big disservice by putting you on that prescription. Maybe the side effects are enough for you to never come back and see me again. Prescriptions are not always the answer, but maybe time is. And we need to get out of that mindset that leaving with a drug means it's a successful appointment. It's not, right? And that's a whole paradigm shift in how we think of modern medicine.
Okay, so you just gave me chills. So we're going to stop here for just a minute because, I mean, my story in a nutshell, and I don't want to take up the time on the podcast to share it because I have an episode about my story, but my story is just years in my 20s, what I felt like, literally years off my life spent in doctor's offices, trying to communicate my chronic pain, my migraine pain, trying to write, me writing down diaries of things that I thought we could be connecting, and then getting into an appointment to only be told we have 15 minutes to chat and maybe I can come back in a month, right? Or try this new pharmaceutical and come back in a month. And I started telling my friends and family that I got to the point where I felt like I was literally like a human guinea pig for pharmaceuticals. And it wasn't until I actually had one of my good friends said this phrase to me, and I say it all the time. I say it to my course takers. I say it everywhere, which is, you are your own best doctor. And I love what you just said about, like, for the patient themselves, for the woman listening who's coming into the office, for you to be the one who sort of helps the doctor to make that connection, right? So I like to call this self-awareness, right? In the fitness world, we call it proprioception. If I tell you to do a squat, do you know where your feet are? Are you just looking at me and thinking that your position and your stance is the same as mine when I do a squat? Or are your feet directly under your hips? Are you fully aligned? A lot of people are not aware of their body and space. And that's a great analogy to them also not being aware of their body and as far as these connections, right? And so that's one of the things that I love about these women that I'm working with now, is when they start to make connections to how they're feeling on a cyclical basis. They start to notice things like, oh yeah, I am in that bad mood every third week of the month, right? Like, I am having these headaches around this same point in my cycle. When they start to make that connection that there are patterns, of course, then it helps whatever doctor they're seeing help them better, because they are the ones making those patterns and those connections. Then they're going into the appointment saying, here's what I've noticed. As opposed to, and I'll be honest, like, this was me in my 20s. I would just go in and I was in such desperation. I was in such pain that I was just like, I was expecting every doctor to be my Dr. House. I don't know if you've ever seen Dr. House on TV, right? Like, he's the one who's like, there must be mold in the gutter, right? And he's like at the house, like looking for the mold in the gutter. And I was looking for that. I was looking for a doctor to put the two things together for me. And it wasn't until probably, I don't know, like 8 years of this horrible experience, like my 20s were literally spent in this, I don't even know, cycle, this endless cycle, that I finally, my friend said to me, you're your own best doctor. Like, start figuring this out, like start putting things together and try to notice what's going on. And that's when I started to make some hormonal connections. And that's when I started asking those types of questions, and I sought a different doctor. The other thing that I want to mention is, I know you're in Canada, but for the American women listening, one thing that I've done that has worked for me, and I'm not saying that it'll work for everyone, is I have asked my doctor for, like, in advance, I've asked for more time. So if the front office staff, for example, gives me a 20-minute appointment, I will say, I'll ask in advance. Now, is this a 20-minute appointment or is this a 40-minute appointment? Is there any way that I could just wait a little bit longer, right? I can wait a couple more weeks to have that longer appointment, just to be more efficient with the doctor's time. But I love that you just said that about making those connections yourself, because you really are your own best doctor. And the more that you can sort of journal what's going on for you and communicate that and be vulnerable and be willing to share, maybe when it does come to psychology, right? Like, sharing what your thoughts are. Are these thoughts normal? Are they not normal? Like, what should I be doing here? And also, don't be afraid of, I love too that you mentioned that obviously there are pharmaceuticals that are needed for everyone when it comes to this kind of stuff. And so that's not something to necessarily go against, but to include the nutraceutical option as well, like to do the omega-3s in addition to maybe any pharmaceuticals that could even help you even more. So that's amazing. Now, I want to make sure we spend a little bit of time on sort of your bread and butter, which is helping our youth. And I think this is good timing too, because obviously I want to say we're coming out of the pandemic, but let's be real. Like, everyone I know has COVID at the moment. So we're coming out of the pandemic, like the 2 years of what we've experienced. And I know, gosh, it seems like there's so much in the world of of mental health, but especially as it pertains to our youth, right? Like I sometimes think my 5-year-old, for example, like she, her age 3 and 4 was sort of just like spent at home, right? Like there was no socialization at the time of her life where you're normally like out socializing and you're meeting people and you're learning to share, right? So we've definitely seen the ramifications of being stuck at home in her now that we're back out into society, right? Like, no, you share the toys, or no, you do this, or it's okay to hug your friends. Like there's so many different things that we are reteaching her. And then again, with my 18-month-old, she was born in 2020. And so we still go to play classes where adults are required to wear masks. And she looks at us like, what is happening? Like, have I entered a third reality? Like, so, but I also think about, I have friends who have teenagers, right? And I've seen, and I've heard their stories of the struggles that teens especially are going through after these last 2 years. So I'd love for you to just speak to this, like speak to where we are right now as a world and what our youth are dealing with.
Yeah, you set that up so beautifully as well, too. And if you think about, I think the ramifications, like you're saying, is from the pediatric age group to the geriatric age group and everybody in between too, because the key point there is the pandemic highlighted something I think that we all intrinsically knew, but that we didn't ever have spelled out for us, was the power of loneliness and the power of the lack of social connection. There's a study that's called the Harvard Study on Adult Development. It's one of the longest running studies. It was done, and it's still running right now, done on men, because way back when Harvard was only for men. So, and it's followed these men now up until their 80s and 90s. And it looked at the fact, they looked at many, many, many different variables. And the researchers said it beautifully, that said that if I looked at a man at their 50s, I didn't need to look at their smoking status, their cholesterol status, how much they drank. All that I needed to look at was how connected they were. And the better they were connected, the better outcomes they had later on in life. So if you look at that very landmark study and translate it into what COVID robbed us of, especially at such a pivotal time for these adolescents, you can only imagine that how did they fill that gap that we used to be filled with hanging out with friends and going to the movies and doing these types of things that all adolescents should and could do? Well, a lot filled it with substances. A lot filled it with experimenting in probably a way that they shouldn't have. A lot filled it with being obsessed to a point of not even sleeping, always on their phone 24/7. They filled it with gaming. They filled it with maybe eating so poorly or really bad eating habits. So it took probably, I'm sure all of us who have had adolescents in our lives know that they're not the most regular scheduled people and those types of things. And that's all fair and good. But COVID put a highlighter on that and really exacerbated those types of behaviors for them. And the resulting impact of that is a tornado. It's not a rainstorm. It's not a thundercloud. It is a tornado of mental health. I walk into clinic all the time thinking that I've heard the worst. There's no one that's going to tell me a story that beats, the story that I heard last week. And there it comes. There's that story. And you also have to realize that this COVID is attacking the most vulnerable of our youth. I had a 17-year-old come in the other day, and she just sat there looking so stoic, and she wanted some antidepressant medication. I said, okay, let's dive into that. I always, semi-jokingly, not to make light of the situation, but I say it takes me 2 seconds to sign my name on the bottom of a prescription. Like, that's not the time, the time crunch here. I need to know why. Tell me your story, just like how we began here today. And she looked at me and she looked to the ground and then finally looked back up and said, well, she's like, you really want to hear my story? I said, yeah, no, I do. And it turns out that she lived with her stepfather for many years, about the ages of, I think it was 11 to 13. And at the age of 12, her stepfather decided to give her cocaine. And he basically gave it to her so that she would become addicted to it, which she did. And in exchange for him giving her the cocaine, she had to basically run the household, take care of all the other children, do all the dishes, do all that stuff. And her payoff at the end of the day was getting this cocaine. And this was her stepfather. So cocaine led to more and more. It was a gateway drug for her, and it led to many, many, many more substances until she finally realized that I can't take this anymore. And about a year prior, she left, and she's living on her own now. Here in BC, we have something called an independent youth agreement, where the government can actually give the youth money if they meet certain criteria and they live on their own. Sounds great on paper, not great always in theory, because now you're looking at a 16-year-old who has to do everything on their own. Not the easiest thing. Now you're an adult. And so you look at like, this is not an atypical story. Like, this is not a one-off story. So the point that I'm trying to make is that the youth that already started off at somewhat a loss, if I can say that appropriately, those are the ones that are getting impacted so deeply, because where were they going to turn in those 2 years for medical support and medical attention? And I had a youth the other day, she said, yeah, I understand anxiety, I understand depression, I get all that. But she's like, doctor, like, what do I do with the pain? What do I do with the pain? And I said, what pain? It's just like, the pain in here. Here I am thinking that she had a physical pain. She's talking about her emotional pain. So this is what we're seeing more and more now too. So I think it's a discussion, and it's a pendulum. It's this idea that we also have to educate our youth too. We've come into a society. I'm very thankful we're talking more about mental health and opening up these conversations, but it's also not a competition. You see this in the youth too. Well, I'm on 3 medications and I've seen this psychiatrist. I've been in hospital this many times. That they're trying to find their own way of significance. We also have to educate them that feeling anxious and having a low mood are normal. We all do at many parts in our life. I had a patient the other day come up to me and said, oh, every time I stand up to give a speech in front of my class, I feel a bit anxious. I need some medication. No, you don't. That's a normal emotion. But my patient who takes 4 hours to go grocery shopping because every time she looks down the aisle, if anybody's there, she can't go next to them. Well, that's a different story. So how much is this impeding and affecting our quality of life? And so it's that pendulum between normalizing certain things and looking at the impact that it's having on their day-to-day life.
So as the mother of 2 girls, how do you go about teaching? This is an interesting topic, and I love that we're at this point in the conversation, because just last week, my 5-year-old, almost 6, she's starting to, she's always had big feelings, but the big feelings really start to come out around now. She's starting kindergarten this fall, and I know she's nervous, right? She just had her last day of preschool recently, and it was an emotional day. And when I say emotional day, I mean emotional week. She even still, like, I miss my preschool, I miss my friends. Why can't I go back? Like, understanding transitions and feeling those feelings. I've mentioned this before on the podcast, on a different interview. We discovered this book that's called, I think it's either called In My Feelings or something about my feelings. And so it's this really great illustrative picture book that really helps her too, when she's feeling a certain way, to identify and show me how she's feeling. But I'm just curious, whether it's a 5 or 6-year-old or a teen, how do we sort of reduce the stigma around talking about anxiety and sort of low feelings, and how do we help our kids understand them?
Oh, it's such a great question. I start with talking about what I like to call the science of emotion. And sometimes when I phrase it like that, parents listen more, adolescents listen more, because they're like, oh, there's something here. It's science. It must be worth something. But that's what I call it. Because throughout my 12 years of postgraduate education, nobody ever talked about this, that emotions have a science and a rhythm to this. So the first key point is that emotions are energy in motion. They just come and they go. Your feelings are your feeling, not your identity. We often confuse the fact that our emotions are our identity, and we do that in a very tangible way, because we don't say, I feel worthless. We say, I am worthless in our head. We don't say, I feel depressed. We say, I am depressed. So simply switching out our vocabulary actually neuronally triggers a feeling of, I had a patient, I am worthless. No, you feel worthless, because when you believe you feel something, you buy into the principle that it has to come and has to go. But the issue is we don't understand that just like a ripple of water, emotions have a beginning, they have a middle, and they have an end. But we all, myself included, have been taught from a very young age that we are not allowed to feel the quote unquote bad emotions. Well, the truth is, and this is where we start teaching our kids from today, that emotions are the rainbow. There is no such thing as a bad or a good emotion. I was taught inevitably this idea that if I felt resentful or jealous or guilty, that was something frowned upon for me. I wasn't allowed to feel those things. And that's completely untrue. And it goes back to the top of the conversation that and at this age, I've got a 2, 5, and 7-year-old. So it's very similar boat. They might not spell out the value systems. But recently, I always tell this story. I was dividing candy amongst the 3 of them, and I did a very cursory job. One child got more, one child got less, and the epic mom mistake. And my eldest, who was about 5, I think, at that time, came and physically just started pounding into me. He was short then, of course, so just into my thighs. And my first response was like, no, you're not allowed. You're not allowed. Of course, I don't condone hitting, but my feeling was you're not allowed to feel mad. You're not allowed. Because in my house, I was never allowed to feel mad. And the second point was that if you feel mad, it means I'm a bad parent. Both of those things are incorrect. So I looked at him and I said, Ishan, I said, you value fairness. You need everything to be fair, don't you? Yes, I need things to be fair. To this day, he is the same child. My middle couldn't care less. Took the candy, ran, totally fine. That he's built, and I wish I had known that when he was 2, because we were having the same conflict then, but who knew? But yeah, I got it right. One conflict out of thousands that we've had. And it's just this investigation for, why does this bug you so much? What is it about that? And that goes back to identifying your kid's value system. So A is understanding the emotion piece, coming and going, right? The beginning, middle, end piece. Second piece is understanding that there is no such thing as a good or bad emotion. It's a comfortable versus an uncomfortable emotion. And then 3 is changing our internal and external dialogue. We even do this with our kids all the time. Oh, you're the smart one. You're the sporty one. You're like, we love, our society loves labels, and we have to, because it makes our brain, it's easier to say, this child is the smart one. This one's the sporty one. And I do this all the time with the 3 boys. And I'm going, shoot, I just pigeonhole you. And that's what we do with our emotion, right? We need to stop doing that.
That's so good. So good. Yeah. We had one particular night, and I'm thinking about this as you're talking, where, she has, I would say she's been into sort of arts and drawing and that kind of stuff, which I think is probably pretty common for her age. But she, one particular evening, I forget what the actual context of the situation was, but long story short, there were some jealousy issues that were happening between the oldest and the youngest, right? There was, in my oldest's eyes, the youngest was getting more attention, or whatever the case was. And so as I was giving my youngest a bath, my oldest is in the loft and she's drawing pictures. And so I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, she's occupied at the moment. It's not her turn for bath yet, kind of keep going. So when it comes time for her bath, she comes in and she, of course, makes a point of being extremely dramatic, which she is, and she's just like this sad face, and her body gestures are very like dramatic. And I'm like, what's the matter? And she's like, you didn't see my pictures I was drawing. And I was like, okay. So I walk into the loft and I look at them, and she had drawn probably 7 sad faces. I'm not kidding. She had drawn faces that were sad with like teardrops coming from the faces. She had cut them out with scissors and taped them to like her desk, her bedroom, her door. And so I was just like, well, sweetie, like, what are you sad about? And of course, we had a whole conversation about it. And of course, I'm just going to throw in here that I know she was hungry. I also know she was tired. So those things always factor in.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a jealousy situation, right? Like she totally had seen something in a certain way. And so we talked through it. But it was interesting because she told me, she said, sometimes my body just feels sad. And it was like for a 5.5-year-old to say that was just like, well, first of all, that's great awareness. Like, and so we talked about the fact that that feeling sad is normal, right? Like there are times where we can feel sad. I always think about Carol Dweck wrote the book Mindset, and she talks about, having a victim mentality as opposed to an abundant mindset. And she talks in her book specifically about how part of what she believes society should do, whether it's in education or in parenting or whatever, is to establish the expectation of failure. Like to say, we should be teaching our children to expect failures in order to grow, as opposed to rewarding only for success, right? And I kept thinking of that in that conversation. I kept thinking about, this is a moment where I have to make sure that I'm vulnerable enough with her, and that I share, well, mommy's sometimes sad and it's okay to be sad. And this is our feeling, like not only identifying the feeling, but also just sort of, I don't want to say normalizing the feeling, but just making her aware of the fact that it's okay to feel that way. So
it's the modeling. I think that the modeling of feelings, I think parenting is exhaustive enough, and it's overly exhaustive if you pretend that everything's okay all the time. And that's a fallacy. It isn't.
Yeah.
And all moms and dads will attest to that. And it's, that your kid is never going to remember your outburst, but what they are going to remember is when you come back and say, look, mommy was feeling really overwhelmed. Mommy was feeling fill in the blanks. And I'm sorry that I reacted that way. Here, how do we move on from that? But that's vulnerability. And it starts with, I never had that growing up. And I think a lot of us didn't too. So it's a new paradigm shift in how we have to start parenting. And it's not easy. And that's not easy at all.
Yeah. Well, I found that from the moment she was born, as my oldest, I realized that really, maybe this is the case for everyone, I'm sure, that there's no handbook on parenting. So you just kind of figure things out as you go. And for that particular circumstance, I came downstairs that night after putting her to bed, and I told my husband about it. And of course, he's pretty laid back. He's like, oh, okay, tomorrow's a new day, and I was just like, I can't get through this. Like, it's just kept bothering me, because of course she was sad. And as humans and as connected beings, we vicariously also feel sad. Right. And so I couldn't let it go. So long story short, I went upstairs, I pulled out her construction paper, and I drew 7 smiley faces. And I hung them all across, like there's sort of a catwalk upstairs in our house. And so I hung them along the railing. And the next morning she didn't say a word, like they were still there. I thought, I'm not going to bring it up. And then finally that night when we were going to bed, she smiled, she came over and smiled and gave me a hug. And she goes, your smiley faces made me happy today. And I said, well, good, because that's why I did it. Right. Yes. And so it's not like there's not always a happy ending, because the girl did turn around and do more sad faces a couple of days later. So, I mean, the story goes on. However, that was a moment in time, so I had to share.
Well, exactly.
Okay. I want to make sure that we sort of connect these two things, because we're talking about, regardless of whether it's our youth or we as women ourselves, and sort of what I would call these internal struggles, right? These thoughts that don't serve us, or this state of fight or flight, right? Which we could go into a whole thing on that. I know that you talk a little bit in your materials about training your brain. What does that look like?
Yeah. So the first, I break it up into 2 parts. Number 1 is parts of what we just covered, which is the science of emotion. And there's more there, but at least we touched on some of the higher level, because you need to understand that in order to understand the second part, which is, we've used that word multiple times today, which is the idea of awareness or self-awareness, which for me is the cornerstone in training your brain. It's been said thousands of times that our external environment is constantly changing, but there has to be something that separates you from not just your external environment, but the other external environment, which is the one that's internal to you. And that's your own voice in your head. No, we all are so enmeshed with our inner roommate, that inner dialogue, that inner radio that never shuts up. And that's just you and the voice in your head. You think that you are that when you are not that. And part of that is the ego. And part of that is just training. And part of that is just trying to create a little bit of space between the thoughts, the thousands and millions of thoughts that you're going to have in a week, and also understanding that, is that true? What evidence do you have it to be true? Is that going to serve you? So I give the analogy, when I was growing up, I don't know why we used to do this, on a very hot pot of soup, we used to take saran wrap and put it over the hot pot of soup. So all you could see was the steam coming up. And then our next step was to take a sharp knife and put little holes in it to vent it. So this analogy of that, when you're having your steaming hot thoughts and you're really finding it hard to get out of that brain loop, how are you going to poke holes in your own theory? How are you going to start questioning that? Do I know that I always suck at everything? Do I know that I'm going to fail when I give this presentation? How do I know that? Right? And part of that is you. Part of that is talking to someone, whether it be a spouse, whether it be a partner, a significant other, a friend, but having a volleyball game where you can bounce things off of, because when it's you and when you've had 40, 50, 60 years of this, I think of it as railroad tracks. Those paths have been groomed and they're fertilized and they're enmeshed in that soil. It's difficult to create new ones. So don't be afraid of seeking help.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've covered some ground here, and I think this is going to help so many people who are listening, whether it's for themselves or through their parenting or whatnot. I have a lot of different places that we could go in the conversation, but I think I'd like to just invite you back for a part 2 at some point, because we are already maxing out on our time. But I want to say thank you for bringing this awareness to us and for sharing your story and for sort of, like I said before, bridging this gap between both mental health and physical health, and how we can really be our own best doctors and pay attention more to have, sort of create this self-awareness in ourselves of not only how we're feeling physically, but also what our thoughts are. I've had several interviews lately on the podcast with trauma-informed therapists. This keeps coming to the surface. This idea that that trauma-informed therapists sort of advise, about I've had different personality types as far as trauma-informed therapists on. I've had different types of people who have different backgrounds and different styles of therapy. But the one thing that remains is this noticing, right? Like noticing of the thoughts that are within you. And I can't help but think about my dear friend and my yoga instructor who every yoga practice says the same sentence, which is, notice the thoughts that are serving you and notice the thoughts that aren't serving you. And let's work in this next hour to let them go. Like the ones that aren't serving you, let's let them go. Right. And so I would just encourage anyone listening to this, like if you are feeling the way I am, this sort of sense of better awareness as it pertains to how our thoughts serve our bodies or don't, I would encourage you to check out what Shahana's got going on. So Shahana, I'd love for you to just tell people, how can they find you? What's the best way to get in contact with you if they have questions? Anything you want to point people to, I will let you do so.
Oh, absolutely. So my website, drshahana.com, on Instagram at the Dr. Shahana. You can find me on LinkedIn as well, Dr. Shahana Alibhai too. Those are the 3 main places that come say hello, send me a DM. Happy to chat and get in touch.
Perfect. I will make sure we link all of that up in the show notes so that everybody can click on that easily. Thank you, my friend, for doing this episode. It's been so great to talk to you. I've got so many more questions for you. We'll save for another time, but thank you so much for being here today.
It's been a pleasure. And honestly, I think it's easy to underestimate the importance of talking about things like mental health. But in my experience, it just takes one. It takes one of these conversations to reach somebody to literally save a life. So thank you for having this platform and inviting me on.
Absolutely. Until we talk again, my friend.
Sounds good.
All right. Bye-bye.